All right, well, we'll get going. All right, so I'm taking practice problems 8 and below are all due by today. If you haven't yet got 8 or below in, just come talk to me. We can still work something out for partial credit. Otherwise, today's the last day. Chapter 9 will be due Tuesday, and then Tuesdays going forward. Now, I graded what you guys had turned in, mostly chapter 8s. Well, not great, but I looked at them, and much better than the last one. I think everyone's mostly on the same page. I think maybe one or two of you still are not on the right book, or maybe you turned it in before you figured out the book situation. But if you're not in the right book, make sure you get that, because you won't have any idea what's going on in the midterm otherwise. But yeah, good work on chapter 8. I think everyone's on the same page from what I've seen so far. Now, there is this question that keeps coming up, and I think I figured it out. It's been stumping me too, is some of these problems that are assigned are discovering data, and we can't figure out what data you're supposed to be discovering. I don't know where these came from. So it turns out these discovering data problems appear to only be in the print edition of the 5th edition. If you have the 5th edition online, it doesn't have these, as far as I can tell. And in the 4th edition, which was our standardized book for the economics department up until this year, doesn't have them. So that's why it's like throwing us off. Like, what is going on with these? Anyway, I've been saying just look it up. If you can Google this stuff, which I still encourage you to do, it's going to be enrich your lives to understand where to find macroeconomic data. But the real thing what's happening here is the publisher inserted these questions and then just moved the question that I want you to answer to the next one. So when you come across these discovering data, just skip it. Go to the next one is the one I want you to do. So in this particular case, it says do practice problem 6. Really, I want you to do practice problem 7. Now, I'm not going to go and update on Moodle because some of you have different editions of the book that don't have it. So then I'll really confuse everyone. So if you have this edition, you come across this, just skip it and go to the next problem. Does that make sense? Any questions? No, we'll get this figured out. We'll get it figured out. By the end of this class, we'll finally know what homework problems to do. Okay. Is anybody expecting to do a presentation today? And Justin? Okay. So we'll do you after the break. Anybody else? You uploaded it, didn't you? Yeah. Okay. All right. We have a lot to do today. This is a big chapter. We'll get to it here in a second. But how's everyone doing? Yeah, thumbs up. Yeah, no, yeah. God, you guys aren't alone. It's bad. I've met with 2 students this week about like office hours, and devolved into, I don't know what I'm doing with my life. I'm miserable. I don't know if I should continue to go to this school. I don't know if I should change my major. Oh man, look, you're not the only one. I work at my main job at Kaiser. These are people with 20 years, 30 years professional. They're doing the same thing. I don't know what's going on with life. I'm miserable. I should change jobs, whatever. Don't stress. Don't stress about this class. Don't stress about anything. Nothing's a big deal right now. College isn't a big deal. You have so many years to figure this stuff out. Don't think about changing schools because every student in every school is miserable right now. I don't know of a single school that has standardized on whether they're going to do online or in person. They are all going back and forth. So even if you're going to Harvard right now, you would be miserable. So just take life with a grain of salt right now. I know I am. I bought a hot tub when I was at home and a cocktail making robot. I'm not kidding. It's a robot that holds liquor and like little Keurig things of like bitters and flavors, and it makes you a cocktail. And my wife and I go home after work and like life sucks and we have a cocktail and sit in the hot tub. And you guys have that to look forward to when you get your job, you get out in the world. That's what your life can be. Just get through this part. Okay, well, let's get going with the lecture. Today's a big one. I don't want to be rushed. So we're delaying. Okay, so we talked about long-term growth. Long-term growth was all about, this is what we want in economics. Why do we want long-term growth? Well, for lots of reasons, but mainly because GDP growth equates to wealth, equates to higher quality of life. As with everything in economics, there's good and bad. So one bad out of long-term economic growth is that we use up natural resources and we pollute the environment. Is that a requirement of what growth? I don't know. We'll discuss a little bit of that. Long-term growth is important. While we have the United States, one of the best qualities of life, we started out pretty good, kept growing consistently. Other countries like China got their act together and started growing. Their quality of life has greatly improved, but when you measure per capita, you see that using this metric, the quality of life of the average person in GDP measured through GDP per capita is less than we were 50 years ago. Okay, we can see that if you look at in $1,900 GDP per capita, so our individual shares of GDP, we've had constant growth over the years, so that we are 8 times more GDP per capita than the year 1900, and that equates to about 8 times richer on average, and 8 times the quality of life. So why do we care about this long-term economic growth? Why is it so important? Well, because we have long-term economic growth, the United States is one of the highest income per person in the world, where other countries that have not had long-term economic growth, such as Central Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, are the poorest, lowest income. And other countries, which South America is really an interesting place, which we'll talk about a little bit more today. Also middle and low income. Really weird. South America was colonized first, had more development than North America first, had slaves, which is a great way to boost GDP and growth, before North America and after North America. Yet here they are, middle income. Okay, we talked about the rule of 70. So the rule of 70 is a mathematical concept where we can look at growth, logarithmic growth, take 70 divided by our annual growth rate, and we can figure out how long it takes to double growth. So we can do this for GDP, we can do this for GDP per capita. All right, so kind of the base assumption here is annual growth rate is consistent. Now, this isn't calculus. We're not measuring at an increasing growth at an increasing rate. It's a consistent growth rate. So if we assume 3% over X amount of time, then we can figure out how long it takes to double. Pretty easy in the United States because we kind of stick to around 3% over the long term. Okay, so let's start examining where long-term growth comes from. Why does the United States have it? Why doesn't Sub-Saharan Africa? Well, the biggest factor is productivity, labor productivity. Now, the book makes a point to say, well, what about population growth? What if you just have more people? Because if you just have more people, even if each one's not more productive, you'll have more productivity. Well, that only works in the short run. In the long run, we have so much data that says that in the long run, even if there's more people, it'll average out and people will leave the workforce and we'll always have about the same labor participation rate. It's just a weird thing about people. So then in the long term, the only thing that really impacts productivity, or excuse me, GDP growth is productivity. So what is productivity? Besides output per worker, that's the most obvious. Well, it's 3 factors. It's physical capital. These are physical things. Your computer is a physical thing. You buy yourself a computer, you're more productive. It's a tractor. It's a building. It's a warehouse. It's a factory. It's physical things you spend capital on to acquire that can affect productivity. Right. The second factor is human capital. This is education. Not just college education, high school education, elementary school education, learning to read and write. Think about how productive our society would be if no one could read or write. This is even more basic. Think about how productive our society would be if every time there was a new moon, you looked up in the sky at night and the moon was gone, or it was a blood moon, you thought that that was an omen, the devil was coming, and you didn't go to work the next week. And this literally happens in parts of the world now. So there's no lack of education, right? Human capital is not just going to grad school. It's everything that makes you eligible to produce something and understand the world around you. Okay, and there's technology, technological progress. This is innovation, efficiencies. When I was a kid, the big story in the business world, it wasn't Amazon or Facebook, it was Walmart. Walmart took over the world. Walmart made a whole generation of billionaires before Microsoft did, before Facebook did. Walmart used technology. And the technology they used was the most unsexy technology you can ever think of. They got really good at moving goods around the country to stores. So you have a penny here, so you have a penny there, getting your goods from the warehouse to make sure that the shelves are stocked. And they took over the retail world. That's technology. Barcodes, the book uses barcodes as an example of technology to track inventory. So technology is not just the shiny iPhone, it's also the really unsexy stuff like inventory control. Okay, so how do you put those three factors together? You do it in the aggregate production function. It's a hypothetical function, right? We're not describing the laws of gravity here. It's a social science, so it's an observation of how these things might apply based on how we interpret lots of data. So we can look at real GDP per worker, and we can do that as a function of physical capital, human capital, and technology. So how that works out is this formula right here. GDP per worker equals T times physical capital worker to the 0.4 power times human capital worker to the 0.6 power. Notice that T, as in technology, does not have an exponent. It's not modified. Physical capital, however, has a 0.4. It's pretty interesting. So if I have some kind of random value here of physical capital, I'm going to throw in a number of 10. The effect on the whole output of the worker is only 0.4 of that. So what is, I don't know what that is. It's much smaller. 2. Well, why is that? Well, it's diminishing returns. Yeah, I think that's the next slide. Let's move on there. Diminishing returns. Imagine how productive you'd be as a student. This is even before my time. I had laptops when I was a student, or computers when I was a student, but before computers. You write out your math, you do your math homework longhand. You write essays with pen and paper. You make a mistake, you throw out a whole page, or you know, if you're writing a pen. You retype or rewrite. And then now you have a laptop. How much faster it is to write an essay. How much faster it is to open a spreadsheet to do some complex math. Way more productive. So how would I then increase your productivity with physical capital, buying you something new? Maybe I'll buy you a second laptop. Will the second laptop make you any more productive? You have two laptops in front of you? No, it's diminishing return. What if I buy you a much faster laptop and get rid of your old one? Yeah, the laptop goes faster, but you don't type faster. Right? So this is a diminishing return to physical capital. That's why it's a 0.4 modifier. If I'm driving a tractor in the field, it's a $20,000 tractor, and I'm a farmer, and I have a great year, so I go buy a $40,000 tractor. Well, maybe it's a little bit bigger. Maybe it's a little bit faster, but it's not double the speed. It's not double the size, so it doesn't double productivity. It's just a small increase. So on average, that averages out to only a 0.4 exponent to the amount of money invested. So here's how you graph out the productivity function. Physical capital per worker, right? And then this is the real GDP per worker. So notice it just, it just says productivity, but we're only mapping out physical capital. So as you can see, the first $20,000 worth of physical capital you supply, whatever that might be, the new tractor, the new factory, your factory you built, whatever, you have so much increase in real GDP per worker. And then you put more investment in, maybe you build an addition on your factory, or you buy the latest tractor, and you have another increase, but look, it's not double the price, but only 30 to 50 for your output. And then you buy the next one, so you add another 20 grand, and look at the productivity, it only goes up by a little bit more. Diminishing returns is such a great concept to learn about a lot more in micro. It applies to everything. Like if you own a coffee stand, you put in one coffee machine and one barista. You make so much coffee, and then you buy a second machine and hire a second barista, you can double it. And then buy a third machine and you get a third barista, maybe you could triple it, your output. But then you get a fourth, and now there's no room. They stumble over each other, and there's diminishing return. You get a fifth, and then there's no extra return. Right? There's always a diminishing return. So how do we see then productivity? If buying more physical assets, more physical capital isn't the answer, we look at education and we look at technology. So if we have the, buy the nicer tractor, doesn't double the output of the harvest. But what if we combine that with the latest GPS technology that drives the tractor on its own and maps out where in the field you are so you don't miss any soil? And what if you combine that with, you send your farmer to school to learn the latest in farming techniques, which by changing out plants or by using the latest soil enhancements, you double output. What's the impact of those three things together? It looks something like this. So we have physical capital per worker, and we have real GDP, so the same graph as before, right? And if we look at here, if we go start at point A, we put in 20,000 in physical capital, we get 30,000 GDP per worker, okay? And then we start putting in more capital like we did before, and we get to C, right? Holding everything else equal, this is not increasing human capital, this is not increasing technology, we just get to here. What happens though when we start using technology advances? We go from A, we go all the way to D. With the same amount of capital we put in, triple the capital here, with using technology as a multiplier, we can get to 4 times the GDP output. And started the chapter by saying, why does the US have constant long-term growth? What does the US do really well? Technology and education. So how do we get these numbers? It's called growth accounting. So we can estimate, the growth accounting is estimating the contributions of each of the 3 growth factors. And the outcome is a total factor of productivity. So the end summary of this is that technology change is crucial to economic growth. The most crucial factor. As you probably guessed when I showed you the formula, and technology is not modified. One input here has its full effect, whereas one input here has a much diminished effect, and one input here has one much diminished effect. Okay, what about natural resources? The use of natural resources was so tied to economic growth for most of human history that it was not believed that you could have any growth or long-term growth without the use of natural resources. But that's no longer the case. So why did the US start out so rich in the earlier graph in 1900? Well, that's because before the 1900, we stumbled upon what we like to believe was an empty country with a bunch of natural resources, and we went west and we turned all those natural resources into economic growth. So tied to that belief is that it was thought that if you ran out of natural resources, then you would no longer have economic growth. That's not the case. We see Japan currently is the 2nd largest or 3rd largest economy in the world with almost no natural resources on their island. So natural resources in theory and in practice now are not tied to long-term economic growth. Okay, so this is one of the economics in action. I don't know if anybody signed up for it, but it's an interesting one. I like it. And this is the idea that technological change, while it's for sure leads to productivity growth, it doesn't do it in a way that's consistent or predictable. And for example, one argument is that all technology innovation that we've seen in the past 20 years, that we haven't actually seen any. That everything that we think is technology innovation now is actually a byproduct of innovation from this period, the World War II to the mid-70s. So it's a pretty actually convincing argument when you read the data and you see that everything that we think is new technology today actually has its roots in something that was invented for the first time here, like your iPhone. Everything in your iPhone was actually technology that was around the 70s. It's just the iPhone miniaturized it and put it together in a new way. But the actual technology isn't new. Almost everything that we look at as technology innovation today comes from this period of huge innovation. And that's what this graph is showing. You had a huge innovation here in this period. It led to huge growth rate. And then you have this period of low growth. And then you have a period of high growth again. Then you have a period of low growth. Well, I don't believe in that argument that everything that was invented in this time period is all that will ever be invented. Because a lot of how innovation works is a lot of stuff that's ended up being invented today is not, it's not visible. We don't see it. We're still trying to figure it out. There's a lot of innovation happening in medical technology, for example, that's completely new that wasn't around here. It's just on the horizon. So that said, so how do you explain this, these returns of innovation on productivity based on innovation? Well, you explain that because people invent something new, and occasionally there's an immediate application. You know, a lot of stuff was invented in World War II for the immediate application of, you know, kill Nazis. That was the goal, it was applied research. But then it took it some time after that to figure out what to do with that innovation, to tie it to productivity. And then you have the computer revolution in this part, 74 to 75. But why is productivity? Computers are the most powerful productivity tool ever invented. So why is it only 0.6 productivity increase? Because it took us 20 years or so to figure out how to make it productive. When companies were buying their first personal computers in the 80s for like the accounting departments and whatever, the accountants didn't know how to use them. They were still doing most of their work the way they learned how to do it, pen and paper, ledger sheets. Then a whole generation of people grew up and improved on the computers and grew up learning them. And then by the 90s, you have this huge boom in productivity because we learned how to use that innovation. And then you have some more innovation here in this time period, and then it takes some time to figure out how to use them. Okay, so why does growth rates differ? Why do some countries have longer, better growth rates than others? Well, the factors of growth rates, one of them is savings and investment spending. So we're going to learn all about this later after spring break, about investment spending, what that means in savings. But as a spoiler, I'll tell you, there's only two things you can do with money. You can spend it and you can save it. I suppose you could put it under your mattress. That would not be one of those things. Because when we talk about saving, we mean put it in a bank account. We don't mean take it out of the banking system by putting it in your mattress. But you spend it or you save it. But where do you save it? You save it at the bank, maybe you buy some stock. Well, what is that? That's investment. Savings equals investment. You keep it in the bank, the bank's not holding on to it, your cash in its vault. It's turning around and giving that to a business, giving that to a person to buy a car so they can drive around delivering Uber. Or you buy stock in the stock market with your savings. Every way of savings, that money ends up being invested somewhere. So the higher the savings, the more the country's investing in it into itself. Education, another determining factor. We standardized education in this country 100 years ago, made it compulsory, and government started funding. So our literacy rates jumped up to 90%. Our math rates jumped up. Research and development started out as an American thing for applied research and development. It was an American concept. Thomas Edison and others said, hey, I can make more money if I research things and improve products and sell them. So companies use applied research to make their own products better, to figure out ways that would sell, to increase efficiencies. I don't know why this slide is. This slide should come before the R&D. This is education, right? As you can see, education. This is adult literacy. Right? You see China's boom in GDP, which started in the 60s and 70s, really taking strides in the 80s and 90s, corresponds with a dramatic increase in literacy. Where Argentina, as an example, the contrast, always had a high literacy rate in the modern times, but they're a unique case where they don't really have a lot of long-term GDP growth for other reasons. Okay, so government policies also encourage long-term growth. So what's government policies? Infrastructure, roads, power lines, ports, information networks. Pretty important stuff. If I want to open a business, open a factory, there's almost no place in this country where I would have to like figure out how to make my own electricity because we have an electricity infrastructure. We have roads and ports to get materials all around, get to the end consumer. What about subsidies to education? All right, made education in the early 1900s. We made it state and federal government funded for K through 12. So we can get our literacy rates and our basic education. So people don't see a lunar eclipse and think the demon is coming and don't go to work the next day. Right. I didn't pull that example out of the air. I read a case where this was causing a problem in some country, Southeast Asia or Africa. I can't remember. Where literally everyone would, businesses would shut down when there was a lunar eclipse because they thought it was a bad omen. Government also subsidizes education, higher education in several ways. Your student loans, which is the reason why I and a lot of people are able to afford education, only happen because the government backs them. Right? Most of you would not qualify for a $100,000 loan from a bank with no job and no credit history if the government didn't back those loans, the subsidies. The government also funds research universities. This one a little bit, but more like the big ones like OSU. By funding all the research the professors are doing. So they apply for federal grants, they pay for their programs, pay for their salaries. They come from federal funds that back up certain, you want research in this area. That's so education is funded that way. OSU as a university, which is one of the biggest in the country, is what I forget they call it, like a level 5 research university. It wouldn't exist without federal funding. Okay, so a lot of that is federal subsidies for education, and that's just pure research. Government subsidies to R&D also happen. So R&D is applied research. So pure research is things like we want to know how ketchup flows down an incline in winter. This is a real study to test viscosity, right? So that's peer research. There's not an application, but we just need to know this. Government will fund that often through education, universities. There's also subsidies to R&D. And this is things like we need a new stealth bomber. So Boeing and Lockheed do some research and there's a $1 billion grant or contract that will pay for this research and the production of the end result. There's R&D, applied to R&D through the National Science Foundation, where we need a specific thing done, all through taxpayer dollars. When the federal government, outside of the military interest, funds R&D and funds education, it's free. This is how it helps long-term growth. Free as in free to access. So the government pays for research, and then you are free to look this research up and come up with a business idea based on it and start a business, creating economic growth. Okay, and then maintaining a well-functioning financial system, which is half the content of this class. There would be no economic growth without a well-functioning financial system. If there wasn't money, right? Government makes the money. Did the government make money? We would be bartering. What if that money lost value? Right? There would be no economic growth. If there was no trust in that money. What if it wasn't easy to transfer money around? The Federal Reserve System, which we learn about later, was one of its major reasons why it exists, was as a way to get, so banks can cash checks with each other. So it still does this. So when you write a check, which I know none of you ever do, but your parents or maybe your grandparents did, how does that money get from the person you give it to out of the bank of the person? Well, it goes to the Federal Reserve, and they then route it to the right bank. So the federal government, the well-functioning financial system allows the free flow of money, protects the value of the money. It loans out money. Okay, protection of property rights. No one's going to open up a factory in a country where gunmen can come take it over. No one's going to buy a house, invest, settle down any place where they can't have legal title to the land. What about intellectual property rights? Why would any business make something if as soon as they make it and sell it, somebody can copy it? So the federal government will protect intellectual property rights. Court system, a way to resolving disputes funded by the government. Without a court system, how do you resolve your problems? With a gun. Right? Political stability and good governance. Why does sub-Saharan Africa and Central Africa, why isn't there a lot of economic development there? No, because every couple of years there's a new government, there's a coup. So not just is it dangerous, but who knows what the new government's going to do? Maybe they're going to say no foreigners. Maybe they're going to nationalize your industry. If there's not stability and good decisions that are predictable, no one's going to invest any money. One of the infrastructure ideas that we often skip over is really basic infrastructure like a clean water system. How productive would you be if this was still 1880 out here in the West and you couldn't turn on your tap and get fresh water? Half your day would be spending going down to the creek. You couldn't go to a job because you would be going to the creek to get water, to wash your kids, to make dinner. And then the other half time when you're not doing that, you're sick because the water's polluted, right? So just basic things, infrastructure allows productivity, clean water, easy, accessible water and electricity. Okay, so East Asia miracle. This is about South Korea and that whole area. Extremely high growth rates in the 20th century. Why is that? Well, in part because they had a long way to go. Right, they were very poor. So what these countries did was, because they were so low, they were smart about it and brought themselves up to a modern standard based on modern countries like the US and Western Europe. And that looks like a huge growth curve. But it's only because there was such a gap between what they were and what they were able to go to. And they were able to go to it by investing in savings, in education, and technology. Well, the technology is a kind of interesting one. And if you think about it, it's kind of, so if you go to Africa, many countries in Africa right now, you probably will have better cell phone service and mobile data than you do here in the United States. Why is that? Well, that's because we invented cell phone technology and we put up a first generation, we built infrastructure investment to build the first generation towers and first generation phones. The technology kept going, and then the second generation came out. And then we had to spend a bunch more money building those towers. And we're still paying off the loans from the first towers. And then the new generation came out. So we actually kind of lagged a little bit because we spent so much, we invested so much in the earlier technology. Countries in sub-Saharan Africa didn't have any cell phone technology for years and years and years. And then like the 1990s come around, the 2000s come around, 2010, and they're, well, we can finally afford cell phone technology. Well, they're not going to start with the first generation. They get the latest technology. So if you're building out a cell phone infrastructure now for the first time, you go with the 5G. So that's what East Asia did, South Korea did, is when they started modernizing in the 70s and 80s, they didn't spend 100 years working their way up. This isn't the game Civilization where you get the research and technology tree. They just borrowed what the Western countries were doing, jumped right ahead. Okay, what's the second? I think another economics in action, but it's kind of interesting. I like to call this the baby boomer problem. What this is about Italy having some growth problems and attributed to the culture in Italy rewarding financially seniority over productivity. So being older and being senior automatically makes you get larger access to the resources, higher income, whatever. Instead of rewarding the people in the company that are more productive. Right? Well, this is what people complain about baby boomers. And just before anybody calls me a boomer, I'm not. Boomers are my parents. I'm on the cusp of millennial and Gen X. But my generation and your generation, we all complain about boomers because they sit at the top, soaking in all the money and holding on to all the houses and keeping real estate prices high and all that. And then you go talk to them and they can't use their phone, right? They can't use basic stuff that we take for granted. So they're not the most efficient, but they're taking on the resources. Well, the same thing with Italy is what they're saying. So that's not a government policy. There was no Italian government policy saying that most senior people get all the reward, but have to be inefficient. It was their culture respected seniority, and it hampered long-term economic growth. Okay, so let's compare and contrast a little bit here. So you have South Korea is this dramatic rise. You have Argentina, which is staying level, and you have Nigeria, which is staying level but ticking, but very poor overall. Because on this axis is real GDP per capita, and down here is a year. So Argentina started out in the 60s fairly rich, much richer than South Korea, much richer than Nigeria, but held steady. Well, we already talked about South Korea. So they made a conscious effort to invest in themselves, to invest in education, and to take the latest technology. And saw this rise. Well, what happened in Argentina? They had a high literacy rate. They had started off rich. Why are they not growing? Well, there's lots of reasons why. For Argentina, it's probably closely related to political corruption, related to culture. United States, for example, we come from this Puritan past where the culture is that if you're sleeping in, you're lazy. If you're not working hard, you need to work hard. You plan for the future, and it comes from almost like a religious nature. Okay? You're going to hell if you don't do it. You're a bad person if you're lazy. Meanwhile, in South America, while these cultures are much more laid back, these cultures are, let's take a nap. We'll get to it tomorrow. I like that culture better personally. So there's a different culture that impacts long-term growth. A lot of political corruption as well. It's hard to have long-term growth when every level of bureaucracy is skimming off the top. You have to bribe everyone. When police won't do their job to enforce property rights. And then also with Argentina and in South America, the US doesn't like people on its borders succeeding. It's a political and a military risk. So we do a lot of destabilizing our neighbors. And we do it in the name of, well, they need to have capitalism, or they need to have democracy. And a lot of these South American countries want different forms of government. So there's a lot of political instability in this time period that is not completely their fault. And then you have Nigeria. Nigeria started out poor and it's picking up, but it mostly remains poor. Where's its growth? Well, same things as Argentina, political instability, corruption. But there's also this argument that they are poor. And poor causes the problems that prevents growth. So if you're poor, then you can't get away from corruption and political instability. You can't get away from people being unhappy, and mad, and hot, and hungry, and lashing out. So does political instability cause their poverty, or does the poverty create a cycle that they can't break out of? Interesting about sub-Saharan Africa and Central Africa is the climate is such that it's low on natural resources. Not a lot of fertile ground, very hot, not a lot of oil. So they had a harder time to break out of that stage that we broke out of 100 years ago, where natural resources don't matter to us as much. There is, however, a boom happening in Nigeria. If you look at, I think it's Nairobi is the capital of Nigeria, but if you look at a picture of Nairobi now, it looks like a modern city. There's lots of skyscrapers, there's towers building things, like Seattle, there's so much activity. They are experiencing a boom now. And part of that is China is doing a lot of investment into Africa, pouring a lot of money into developing the infrastructure in order to extract resources. And this is what I was just saying here. Africa, corruption, instability, and unfavorable geography. Okay, so here's real GDP per capita for the US and real median income. Now on Tuesday, or maybe last week, we talked about how real GDP per capita more or less correlates with income. So if you increase real GDP by 1%, you should see an equivalent 1% increase in median income. Well, look what this is showing us. Starting in the 80s, the 90s, real GDP per capita for the United States keeps going up. But real median income is leveling off. So what is that saying to us? That's saying we're getting richer as a country, but the average person is not increasing their wealth. So anybody have any ideas why that might be? Yeah.
The rich are just getting richer, and then the median average.
Yeah, so that's part of it. So the rich get richer. Would you say the poor get poorer?
Yeah.
Okay, so why? Why is that happening? Why do the rich get richer? I mean, it's obviously it's a complicated thing, but
Yeah.
any particular ideas? Okay, nothing comes to mind. I put you on the spot. Yeah.
I'm willing to guess that the rich can use their money to get more investments or put in their money into something to get more profit back.
Yeah. So that's definitely part of it. So, but I think more specifically, the rich are getting richer in large part because of that, because some policies will reward that use of capital. And the other part is the rich get richer because they're more educated, right? And all the factors we looked at: long-term growth, education, infrastructure. These benefit the people that are richer. And the richer have more education, so they get better jobs. They're able to hold on to their money. The poor get poorer, in part because of this idea of convergence, which will, the next slide, maybe we'll go to that. No, we'll go to that second. Convergence meaning that this in a globalized world, this wealth is no longer stuck in countries. So if we look at China's real median income, it would be much closer to their growth. And that's because the jobs that the poor were doing in our country, the less educated were doing in our country, or manufacturing, went overseas. So that wealth was transferred overseas. That wealth was transferred to China and other places. So the rich get richer because of they're benefiting off the education and infrastructure that benefits intellectual workers here. And the poor get poorer because those jobs are offshored to China. So is it good or bad? There's always a winner and loser. If you ever take a class in economics for international trade, the central theme to learn the whole class is that trade makes the country better. Each country that involves does trade gets richer. But in that, there's winners and losers. In our country, the winners now are the educated information workers, and the losers are the uneducated, skills-based jobs. So you can see this convergence happening here. This is real GDP growth, annual growth from 55 to 2015, and this is the real GDP per capita in 55 using today's dollars. Right. So we can see in 55, real GDP per capita for Japan was pretty low, very poor. Individual wealth was poor, but they've had sustained high growth rate. And then over here, we started off rich at 55, but sustained lower growth rate. There's this correlation here. What does this mean? Well, if we look over here, the world as a whole, you look at East Asia, very poor in 55, but had a high growth rate. Where does that growth go? So anyway, convergence is just this idea that wealth is, poor countries in a globalized world get wealthier, and rich countries lose some of that, but not uniformly. Okay, is the growth sustainable? So growth has been tied to natural resources. We've understood that we can uncouple that, but how much can we? So the miracle of the modern world has long been called oil. It's led to the growth of the 20th century. But we're running out of oil, and burning oil in the long term is going to kill us all. So how do we make it sustainable to our growth without destroying our environment, without using all those resources up? So there's questions economists ask: how large are the supplies of natural resources? We thought oil was running out in the 70s, but we found more, and we found better ways and more efficient ways to get it out of the ground. How effective are we in finding alternatives to those natural resources? There has not been an alternative to oil. There still really isn't. We're getting there. But for 100 years, we couldn't stop using oil. The world would come to a crashing halt. Now we're getting better at finding alternatives. And can we have that growth using alternatives? So here's what oil looks like, the price of oil. US domestic oil prices, and over time. So low, and then it goes way to sky high. Why did it go sky high here? Well, it went sky high here because of artificial resource scarcity. Oil producing countries that are not the United States got together and said, we want more money, we want to teach America a lesson, and they hiked up prices, causing oil and gas shortages for us, raising prices. And then we come here and we start investing into alternative sources of finding oil and pumping out of the ground, fracking, start producing our own domestic supply more, and we started invading countries that were mean to us here. This is what happened in the 90s, where we went to Iraq. We didn't really like the fact that they said no oil. So we started discovering how to pump oil out of our own ground better. So using oil shale, we have huge deposits. We have the largest oil deposit in the world in this country. But it's in the form of oil sands and oil shale, which is really hard. It's like sand soaked in oil. It's really hard to get the oil out of the sand. And in the Middle East, they have what's called sweet crude. And it's nice and light, sweet. It's not really sweet, but they call it sweet because you just pump it out of the ground. It's so easy to refine. And then you come here in the oil shale, it's impossible to get out of the rock and the sand, and it's really hard to refine. But we figured out how to do it. So that's why these prices are fluctuating. Okay, so engineers are figuring out ways to find alternatives. Solar is one. So we have one burst in solar output happen in Europe, especially in Germany, in the 90s and early 2000s, where they had governmental economic policy to encourage solar growth. And what they did was, they said that their national power grid, they said, we'll sell you electricity at 10 cents a watt or whatever, but we'll buy it back from you at 20 cents. So everyone that's quick-witted went out and bought a bunch of solar panels because they can make money off it, because they can sell it for so much more than they can buy it for. So Germany had this huge boom in solar based on that government policy. Now, in the last 10 years, solar panels have decreased the cost to manufacture and the cost to buy by some kind of ridiculous amount. It's like 1/8 the cost now than it was 10 years ago. And that was a natural hand, the visible hand of the economy working, because companies started manufacturing more, flooding the market, lowering, increasing supply, shifting that curve over, so prices dropped. Okay. And then we'll wrap up here with this, but just quickly, what this means economic growth. So we now associate economic growth, a lot of us, with ruining the environment and global warming. And we just want to look at, so the blue is United States and CO2 emissions, and we kind of stabilized over the past 40 years, little growth. So why is that? We're better. Is it because we started making cars that turn their engine off at stoplights? I don't know. It's because we're being a little bit more efficient with our resources. Is it because we passed policies to hold polluters accountable? Probably a little bit of that. But probably mostly because we offloaded all our polluting industries to China, and you see China's contributions to global warming skyrocketing. Okay, well, let's take a 5-minute break, and then when we come back, we'll do our presentation. So 35 after. All right, I think we can get going. Justin, do you want to come up and?
So the first one was Airpocalypse Now. So the summary was a severe air pollution in China cities is a product of extraordinary economic growth in the past 2 decades, which has raised hundreds of millions of people out of abject poverty. And the rise in economic wealth has led to the increase of demands in better food, better housing, and consumer goods, including cars. So in 2007, there were fewer than 60 million motor vehicles in China. And by 2016, the number has tripled. And the growth of China's car population is faster than its pollution control. So why is this in this chapter? So it's an example of long-run economic growth, which is a sustained increase in output per capita. But in comparison, China is playing a catch-up game with economically advanced countries like the United States and Japan. And these countries have began the process of long-run economic growth, and some have started more than a century ago. So some background information. So China started it in 1978, which is known as the Chinese Economic Reform, when Deng Xiaoping introduced the concept of a socialist market, which opened China to foreign investors and lowered other trade barriers. And in that time, the poverty level dropped from 88% in 1981 to 6% in 2017. Okay, so the next one was breaking through in Bangladesh. So the summary was Bangladesh is very poor, so it's not really a political hotspot, doesn't have any oil, and is overshadowed by its neighbor, which was India. But it's home to more than 160 million people. And as recent as the 1980s, real GDP per capita was barely higher than it was in the 1950s. And the country lived on the edge of starvation. In the early 1990s, it began a process of political and economic reform when it went from a military rule to democracy, freeing up markets and achieving monetary and fiscal stability. And this led to the rise of Bangladesh as a major exporter of clothing to Western markets. And real GDP per capita grew at over 3% per year from late 1980s to 2010, and which doubled over the 20-year period from 1990 to 2010. And real GDP per capita in 2015 was almost 2.5 times what it was in 1980. And the quality of life improved in Bangladesh, which saw life expectancy rise by a dozen years. Child mortality fell by 70%, and school enrollment rose sharply, especially for girls. But Bangladesh is still incredibly poor by like US standards. So like the wages are still very low, but it's rising, and working conditions are often terrible and dangerous. And Bangladesh has achieved a lot of progress compared to like its own past. So why it is in this chapter, it shows also the effects of long-run economic growth in a country that only started about 30 years ago. And the quality of life in Bangladesh is a little bit better than it was before. So the economic principle in play was when markets don't achieve efficiency, government intervention can improve society's welfare. So I think it's kind of like when they went from military rule to democracy, this kind of led to it becoming more efficient, kind of, and an increase in GDP, real GDP per capita. Yeah.
All right. Great. Okay, well, I'm a lot of things to say today. Why don't we do the quiz? I think I forgot to put a password on it, so see if it opens. And then Austin online, go ahead and do the quiz now if you're ready, and it closes at 4 o'clock, so no one can do it after 4. And I'm going to log off. Have a good day.